News about that oil tanker, the Marinera. It has been secured, according to US officials. The Department of Homeland Security apparently led the operation with US military support, and US law enforcement officials are currently on board. So the US has successfully intercepted that oil tanker believed to be carrying oil from Venezuela. More on that as we get it.
Now you're asking the question of cost. It's a disingenuous question to begin with. You're trying to find any angle possible to undermine the success of one of the most historic military missions the world has ever seen. The level of sophistication that Senate just was briefed on, and the House was briefed on, a classified level, is something only the United States of America can accomplish. The world is taking notice of that. Certainly Venezuela is taking notice of that. And it continues because two oil tankers, overnight, were seized by the United States of America, stateless or sanctioned, because the oil blockade, the quarantine of oil out of unsanctioned or sanctioned or stateless vessels continues. That leverage will continue, as Secretary Rubio outlined. So our military is prepared to continue this. As he said, the president, when he speaks, he means it. He's not messing around. We are an administration of action to advance our interests, and that is on full display. We're happy to bring it out.
Year after year, the vote is lopsided. The world says end the embargo, but the resolution is non-binding. Washington isn't just declaring sanctions, it's enforcing them through financial choke points, shipping pressure, and occasional interdictions that remind everyone where the hard power sits. Now let's talk about Cuba, and the part most people miss. Because the most revealing thing about the Cuba embargo isn't that the world votes against it. The revealing thing is what doesn't happen next. If the UN General Assembly vote is overwhelming, why doesn't the UN Security Council stop it? Here's the uncomfortable answer. The Security Council doesn't vote down US unilateral sanctions the way the General Assembly symbolically condemns them. This is because the Security Council is built on veto power, and the United States is one of the 5 states that can block anything it doesn't like. So the UN's loudest moral forum, the General Assembly, can condemn the embargo. But the UN's binding enforcement forum, the Security Council, is structurally incapable of forcing the US to stop when the US says no. In the abstract, that's not a failure of the UN. That's the system working exactly as designed. Law and legitimacy on one side, veto and power on the other. And this is why Cuba matters far beyond Cuba. Because Cuba is the long-running demonstration that global oversight exists, but only up to the border of great power privilege. Now, what happens if countries unilaterally decide they will not respect US unilateral sanctions on Cuba? Technically, countries do it all the time, quietly. They trade, they ship, they bank through intermediaries, they route payments in ways that avoid US jurisdiction. The problem is not international law in theory. The problem is enforcement in practice. The United States doesn't need a UN resolution to make sanctions bite. It needs 3 tools. First, the dollar system. If your trade touches US dollars, US banks, US correspondent banking, or any institution that fears losing access to US finance, Washington's sanctions reach you. The modern sanctions regime is built on access. That's access to clearing, access to markets, access to the US financial bloodstream. Second, secondary pressure. Even when sanctions are unilateral, the US can punish non-US companies through blacklisting, fines, market denial, visa restrictions, and compliance intimidation. That's how a national policy becomes global behavior. Not because everyone agrees, but because many cannot afford the penalty for disagreeing. Third, physical logistics. Shipping insurers, port services, flag registries, maritime classification, satellite tracking, and interdiction risk. These are pressure points. When the US brands a vessel sanctioned, dark fleet, or stateless, it's not just a label. It's a signal to insurers, ports, and banks. Touch this cargo and you may be next. So if a country says, we don't recognize your embargo, the reality becomes, can they trade without touching U.S. money, U.S. insurers, U.S. logistics, and U.S. exposed banks? That's why Cuba's story is not only a Caribbean story, it's a systems story. Now let's get to the heart of your question. Is there no oversight authority to stop U.S. intervention, like blocking trade routes or seizing tankers, when other countries violate the embargo? There are forums, there is law, but the truth is, enforcement against a superpower is not automatic. It's political, slow, and often optional. What avenues exist? 1. The International Court of Justice. But the ICJ usually requires state consent. If the U.S. doesn't accept jurisdiction over a given dispute, you can't just drag it there and expect a ruling that compels compliance. And even when the ICJ rules, enforcement still runs into power politics. 2. The World Trade Organization. In theory, unilateral trade restrictions can be challenged. In reality, sanctions get wrapped in national security arguments, and once that door opens, trade law becomes a battlefield of exceptions. 3. Maritime law pathways. If you're talking about interdictions and seizures at sea, there are principles under the law of the sea. But again, who enforces them, and against whom? The strongest states interpret legality as they go, and smaller states measure the cost of pushing back. 4. Domestic courts and blocking statutes. This is where it gets practical. The European Union, for example, has historically used blocking measures to resist extraterritorial U.S. sanctions in other contexts, basically telling EU firms, you're not supposed to comply with foreign sanctions. But even that has limits, because companies still fear losing the U.S. market. So they choose compliance anyway, not because Brussels told them to, but because Washington can hurt them more. So yes, justice can be sought, but justice is not guaranteed. And that's the point. Now let's look at the recent case where the U.S. seized Venezuelan oil by force, gunboat. Whether someone agrees with Washington's justification or not, the underlying point is that there is a spectrum from paper sanctions to active enforcement, and when sanctions meet naval power, the world learns a lesson about hierarchy. This is exactly why Cuba's embargo isn't just an economic policy. It's a disciplinary architecture. It tells every country watching, we can make your trade expensive. We can make your shipping risky. We can make your banking painful. And if you push too far, we can show up in the physical world too. The news is simple. The UN General Assembly keeps voting against the embargo, and it changes nothing. The embargo survives not because the world agrees, but because the United States has built a sanctions system that doesn't need global permission to be globally effective. When Washington tightens pressure, Cuba looks for oxygen. That oxygen comes from partners willing to trade outside the U.S. comfort zone, willing to provide fuel, financing, technology, and diplomatic cover. From Washington's perspective, those alliances become the justification, meaning Cuba is aligned with adversaries. But from Cuba's perspective, it's survival. We were sanctioned into needing alternatives. That's the loop. Sanctions create dependency on non-Western partners, and that dependency is then used to justify more sanctions, a self-reinforcing cycle. What does this mean for the world we live in? If more countries openly ignore U.S. unilateral sanctions, one of two things will happen. Either Washington escalates enforcement, more penalties, more blacklists, more seizures, more pressure, and it risks accelerating de-dollarization behavior and alternative payment systems. Or Washington selectively tolerates it because enforcement has costs, and because overuse turns sanctions from a tool into a brand that says the U.S. can be unpredictable and you might be next. And here's the biggest strategic cost for the United States. Sanctions are most powerful when they are seen as exceptional. When they become routine, the world builds workarounds slowly, imperfectly, but relentlessly. This is why you see an emerging pattern globally with countries hedging. Not all at once, not loudly, but enough to matter. Alternative payment rails, non-dollar swaps, regional trade arrangements, quiet corridor building. Cuba, in that sense, is an early chapter of a longer book, how power enforces economic order when formal global governance can't compel it. Now you might ask, is this unjust, and can the world stop it? Here's the calm prosecutor answer. The world can contest it, but it can't easily stop it without collective risk. Because to stop it, you'd need states to coordinate countermeasures that impose costs on the U.S. too, and many states won't, because they depend on U.S. market access, U.S. security umbrellas, or U.S-linked finance. So the system persists. And that returns us to the Security Council question one more time, because it's the punchline. The UN General Assembly is the world's conscience on paper. The UN Security Council is the world's enforcement arm in theory. But when the enforcement arm is controlled by veto states, the conscience can scream and still be ignored. That is not cynicism. That is the architecture of the post-1945 order. So what should viewers watch next if they want to understand Cuba beyond slogans? Watch enforcement, not announcements. Are banks tightening? Are shipping insurers refusing? Are ports denying? Those are the real sanctions indicators. Watch the alliance lanes. When Cuba deepens energy or logistics ties with Russia, China, or Iran, that tells you where the oxygen is coming from. Watch U.S. election politics. Cuba policy is often used as domestic theater, and theater drives policy choices that outlive the election cycle. Watch third-party resistance. If more states begin using blocking measures, alternative payment mechanisms, or regional trade arrangements that bypass U.S. exposure, the sanctions system faces friction. And watch the moral contradiction, a world that votes overwhelmingly against a policy, but lives under it anyway. That contradiction is where the real story sits. Because the Cuba embargo is not just about Cuba. It's about whether global rules mean anything when power refuses to comply, and whether oversight is real if the overseer can't touch the strongest actor in the room. Cuba is the case study that proves sanctions are not enforced by global consensus. They are enforced by control of choke points. This is Liberation Lens. We report the news, then we lay bare the structure underneath it. If you want the next part, we'll map the sanctions machine step by step, banking, shipping, blacklists, and then map Cuba's counter-strategy and what it reveals about a world drifting from rules to blocks.